Okay, so let me run something else by you. Since we've laid out this, I want to run a proposition by you. And it's sort of a variant of the meme theory, although it takes into account the idea that so-called memes, abstractions, compete across historical and evolutionary time. So imagine this. So
this is memes in the Dawkins sense.
Yeah. So imagine that there is this level of sensory input that is as close to corresponding with objective reality as we can manage. And then imagine that that's interpreted within this hierarchical framework that we described. Levels of abstraction that rise up to ineffability, essentially. That would be something like the meaning of the fact that you hit the table in this particular context, right? Okay, so now imagine you've got this, imagine that every level of that hierarchy and the totality of the hierarchy competes across evolutionary time. So one way of grounding our thinking in data is to assume that all of what we know emerges from raw sense data. But there's another way of thinking about it, which is that the data is interpreted within a hierarchical framework that's full of feedback loops, right? And there's variant forms of those upper level hierarchies. But those forms compete across time. And the more successfully they compete across time, the more they become instantiated physiologically. That's a Baldwin effect selection mechanism. The higher order interpretive structures that produce the best reproductive outcome across time are more likely to become automated at a instinctual level. Emotions would be like that. Like they're not as automatized as spinal reflexes, but they're quite automatized because the sets of emotions that human beings have are very similar. Anger, fear, surprise, joy, etc. Everyone feels those. When and where is different, but the fact of the emotions is the same. Then imagine that this is something like the domain of iterable and playable games. So imagine that there's a variety of different interpretive frameworks that we lay upon more basic sensory data, but that a relatively small subset of those interpretive frameworks has the capacity for sustainable improvement. So you could think about this in the context, let's say, of a marital relationship, right? There's a very large number of ways that your marriage can go wrong. Like an indefinite number of ways that your marriage can go wrong. But then there's a constrained number of ways that it will go right. And that's because it's a difficult target. Imagine that the specifications are something like, for your marriage to be successful, the micro routines and the macro routines have to be such that you're voluntarily okay with them and your wife is voluntarily okay with them. And they bond you more tightly together across time. And this would be the optimal situation. As you lay them out together, they improve. Okay, and so you could imagine that as the basis for an optimized contractual relationship of any form. But then you could also imagine that the number of variants of the way that you can treat each other for all of those conditions to be met would be low. There's a very small number of voluntary playable games that are iterable across large spans of time that improve as you play them.
Right.
Okay, so then you'd get an evolutionary pressure as well on the domains of possible philosophy, right? That they'd fill up something like a space. And that seems to me to be reflective. It's weird because that's also reflective of an empirical reality, but it's not the reality that's associated with basic sense data. It's more the fact that there is a finite number of complex games that are voluntary playable and that improve. And that's also a fact, right? I mean, and that would be, I think that's partly why there are patterns of ethics that tend to emerge in many different cultures, even independently, right? And that also makes a mockery in some ways of a really radical relativism. It's like, it's not the value space, the philosophical space isn't relativistic because there's a finite number of interpretive frameworks that actually have anything approximating productive staying power. And that is reflective of something like the structure of reality. It's more sophisticated reflection than the basic sense data. And so, see, I'm saying this because I'm trying to mediate between the postmodern claim that we see the world through a narrative, which I think that's true. I think all the neuroscience data points in that direction. And then you might say, well, any old story goes then. It's like, no, just because we see the world through a story doesn't mean that the stories themselves aren't constrained by empirical reality in its most sophisticated sense. And it also doesn't mean that the stories, even though they're stories, fail to correspond to reality.
Okay. That's extraordinarily rich, everything that you're laying out there. Let me just start with one thread to pull out. I do not like the language that says we see reality through a narrative. I understand the attraction of it.
I can make a more technical description.
No. If we just start with that formulation, I think that's a dangerous formulation. I do think the postmoderns are on board with that. But notice what it says. It says there's a we, there's a me, and then there's a narrative, and then there's reality out there. And that I have to go through this narrative to get to reality.
Like a screen.
That's right. And it might be, it might have some chinks in it. It might be opaque, right? But also what this narrative is has got a huge amount of stuff built into it, right? All kinds of background expectations and theories and slippery terms, right? And so forth. What I would say is, to use this language, is that narratives are things that we use to see reality if the narrative is true. So sometimes narratives get reality right. Sometimes narratives are wildly off basis. Right?
Yeah, that's in keeping with this idea of competition across time.
Okay, that's for sure. But rather than seeing the narrative as a screen or as an obstacle or an intermediary, it itself is a tool. It's a state that our psychological conscious apparatus is in when we are relating to reality. Okay, so that's if we get it right.
Okay, so
but if we mess it up, then it does become something that we try to see reality through, and we're in a problematic situation.
As Christmas approaches, there's a beautiful opportunity to keep God at the center of this season through Hallow, the #1 prayer app. They're launching a special Advent prayer challenge called For God So Loved the World that promises to be a transformative spiritual journey. This challenge features an incredible lineup of guides. Survivalist Bear Grylls and Jonathan Rumi from The Chosen will lead you through a severe mercy, a powerful story of faith and divine love. You'll join Pastor Francis Chan and Jeff Cavins for profound scripture reflections, while actor Kevin James explores the spiritual classic Divine Intimacy. The experience is enriched with beautiful Advent music from award-winning artists including Gwen Stefani, Lauren Daigle, and Matt Maher. It's more than just daily prayer, it's an invitation to experience God's love, mercy, and healing in a deeper way. Don't wait. Get 3 months of Hallow free at hallow.com/Jordan. Make this a time of putting God at the center and experience the good that comes from it. That's hallow.com/Jordan for 3 months free.
Okay, so let me reformulate the description, and then let's see if that rectifies that problem, and then let's see where we can go with that problem, because I'll object to your objection and see where that goes. So I would say a narrative is a description of the structure through which we see the world, right? That's a different claim. So because it's not a narrative until I tell it to
But then you've dropped reality out of the picture.
Well, that's exactly why I want to have this discussion, because I don't want it. I think it's very dangerous. It's kind of obvious to drop reality out of the situation. But you're right that the danger of the postmodern formulation which is that we see the world through a narrative, let's say, is exactly that, is that the reality drops out of the equation. There's nothing but the text, let's say. Like if there's a competition between narratives for their functionality, let's say, reproductive and otherwise, that would go some way to addressing that problem, because there'd be a Darwinian competition between narrative structures that would prioritize some over others. And so, but the description part, the idea that it's a description is relevant. So imagine that wolves in a pack, at a perceptual level, the wolves distinguish the rank order of the wolf that they're seeing. And they do that extremely rapidly. Highly social animals are unbelievably good at that. And so the story of the dominance, the story of the hierarchy of the wolves is implicit in the perception of the wolves. And if you describe that, it's a story, but it's not a story before it's described. It's whatever a story is before it's described.
Right.
It seems to me like it's something like the weights in a neural network, returning to that idea, is that there are certain facts, let's say, that present themselves to us that are much more heavily weighted. And that's axiomatic. It's built into the system. And those would be facts, imagine that evoke emotional response very rapidly. They're weighted, and that weighting has a biological element and a cultural element. Now, that's not a story. But if you describe that, that's what a story is.
The scientist who's studying the wolves is creating a story.
That's right.
No,
that's
not
right.
creating. I'm going to say constructing a story.
Yes.
But it's a story about something that's not happening, mediated through stories in the wolves.
Yes, right. For the wolves, it's a pattern of behavior and a pattern of perception.
Yes.
It's not a, so imagine this is when you go to see a movie, you take on the weighting, the value structure of the protagonist. Now, human beings are very good at that. Like, we look at each other's eyes and we see what people are attending to, and we watch their patterns of attention, and we infer their valuation and their motivation. We're unbelievably good at that. And that's what you're doing when you're going to a movie. We watch how the protagonist prioritizes his attention and his action, what his priorities are, and you infer from that the perceptual structure that, well, that's the question. Does it bring some facts to light and make others irrelevant? And if so, is it a screen? Like, most of the world we don't see. Most of the world is screened out from our perception. Some of that's biomechanical. I can't see behind my head. But some of it is, I'm looking at you, so I can't see the faces of the cameramen right now, right? So that's a choice that's dependent on my determination of how to focus my attention. Now, the fact that I'm prioritizing you, I can see your face, I'm using the foveal center of my vision, and I can't see these guys because they're in my periphery. That's kind of like a screen, right? The place where it's most open is this central point of vision. Over here, it's obscured, and over here, it's just gone completely. So now, you objected to my characterization because you said, observer, screen, reality, and you didn't like the proposition of the intermediary screen.
Yes.
And I know the screening idea isn't exactly right. But on the counter side, we have this problem. Some things are central to our perception and other things are peripheral. And that's dependent on our values and our patterns of attention and our actions. So, well, I'm curious about what you think about that.
Well, I think you're putting two kinds of examples out on the table. They're going to be related. I think the first one where we are looking at a human being, say an actor on a screen,
right,
putting ourselves in that person's shoes and reading all sorts of things.
Reading the world.
I think that's very extraordinarily complicated. And I think the interesting thing there is going to be, while you say that we humans are very good at that, the interesting thing is going to be how much of that is learned, because it doesn't seem to be a highly fallible process. Because I know, don't want to get too personal here, but there will be lots of times I've been in social circumstances, and I think I'm pretty savvy about reading people. But I'll be with my wife, and she will say, after we've had a conversation with someone, boy, did you notice how upset that person was about blah blah blah?
Women and their interpersonal perception.
Okay, so there may be sex, gender differences.
Yeah, they're better at reading nonverbal behavior.
That are going on, but also at the same time, it's not to say that I couldn't learn how to do that.
Yeah.
So when we say people are very good at that, I think that's true, but we still have to epistemologically unpack everything that goes into what makes us good at being able to do that. And I think that's going to be a very, very sophisticated story. But then the other example takes us back to perceptual cases where you're talking about, you looking at me or me looking at you, and we're also aware that we're in a room, that there are other people in the room who are filling and so on. But getting right down to issues of, if I choose to focus on one thing, then it is true that everything else goes
pales by comparison.
Yeah, that's right. And pales is metaphorical. So if we're going to try to then unpack the metaphor, I think we would say we focus and unfocus, and then we can give descriptors of what the state of unfocus is and what the state of focus is. And I would prefer using that language to the language of screen, because screen really is something that is in the way. It's a thing itself. That's another obstacle. Right. So if it's
so how about
if there's a dressing screen between the two of us and I'm dressing for privacy, right? The whole idea of the screen is that it's blocking.
Right. So the metaphor is too simple.
That would be different from, and I think a better metaphor would be to say to filter. And I think sometimes our sensory apparatuses are engaging in filter. They're just attending to some things and not attending to other things. Yeah. But a filter is different from a screen.
Okay, so I have
also just to stay on this one issue here, the issue of focus and unfocus, I think it's not a filter either.